criminal justice reform. And so Oklahoma Policy Institute, which is our state's kind of premier left of center, I guess they sometimes get marketed as policy think tank, but really it's our state's like only like policy think tank that actually like analyzes problems and tries to come up with actual solutions for them. But they dropped a really well done, pretty extensive blog on fines and fees. And that hit yesterday. Got to read through it some. But their main, I guess, premise is that rural Oklahomans frequently carry larger burden of for court costs and fines. And so, we'll talk a little bit about kind of how the legislature, who has known about this issue for years, maybe dealt with it or has thought about it. We'll talk about that in a bit. But I wanted to like kind of lead off with this kind of heavier policy piece because it really said some interesting stuff, which was fines and fees per capita. So what they did was they took all the fines and fees that people have and then divided them by population and found kind of like how much fines and fees were being assessed and kind of how hard they were hitting certain communities. And what was interesting was they found that in a lot of rural areas, people are like really paying through the nose on this stuff. And if I had to like summarize the issue with like fines and fees, just in the simplest possible terms, is two things. One, it doesn't do the work you think it does. Most of the people you're fining and feeing are unable to pay them. So you are assigning because like the logic is, or at least what they claim their logic is that, do the crime, do the time, and pay the fine. But the reality is that since a lot of our criminal justice system is just poverty driven, a lot of people in it don't have any money. And so by trying to make them pay for their own incarceration, they're just not. And so you've got people who made a mistake, mostly just got caught, and now they just like they're in a cycle that they'll never get out of. Like they owe so much in fines and fees, they'll never pay them back. What they are able to pay back is extremely onerous and keeps them kind of stuck. And so you've got these folks that are just so it's not doing the work you think it's doing. So we assign all these fines and fees, nobody can pay it, and so it's just kind of this backwards conservative logic on the criminal justice system. And now what we're finding is that rural folks are paying even more. And, you don't have to be an expert in economics to know that rural areas also don't have as much money. I mean, their economies are struggling more often than suburban and urban economies. And so it's just compounding the problems for these folks. And so I thought it was a really good piece. I thought it really made a lot of sense and really laid out well a lot of the issues with fines and fees.
Yeah, it definitely highlights the inequity that exists within that system. But it's interesting because these people who are really prevalent in the ideas that fines and fees are a good thing have had access to this knowledge for decades. It's not, while this piece is shedding light on these statistics for the general public, like these aren't numbers that our legislatures haven't had access to. These aren't reports that haven't been drafted for them to see. So it's always interesting that, I remember when I had this like realization that politicians saw the bad stuff and it wasn't just people. Like I remember, this is a tangent, but I remember going to DC for the first time and seeing people experiencing homelessness. And I was like, Dad, why are people homeless in DC? Like the president can see these people.
Yeah.
Like it was such a naive, and I was like 14. So like, please give me slack. But it was like such a naivety of like politician. I was like, problems just aren't getting to them. You know, these numbers just are not being reported to them, like they're in the dark. But it's like politicians are the most well-informed members of our community when it comes to these inequalities. And yet they're still perpetuating the lies that's like, oh, these are working, oh, these are helping people reform in some like delusional mind. So it's always interesting to me when I see evidence of like politicians having the information and yet still perpetuating like the falsehoods about the system.
Yeah. And I didn't actually make my second point. I got myself talking in circles. But my other point was I was going to say is from a policy standpoint, fines and fees are insanely regressive. So what that means is like, say two people go out and commit the exact same infraction. You're speeding 25 miles over the speed limit. So it's a huge, $300 fine that you get for that. A person or a family or a household that makes $25,000 a year, that is 4 times the impact. You both get the same exact fine as a household that makes $100,000 a year. Mm-hmm. So when you think about both groups go out and do the exact same crimes, smoke weed, do a little coke, whatever it is, both groups go out and do it. One group gets 4 times the impact because they get assessed the exact same amount of fines. Mm-hmm. So you think about like DUIs is a big one. A rich person can go out and commit multiple DUIs. They'll just keep paying bigger and bigger fines, but they can do that because they're rich. A poor person destroys their entire life. So I think it's maybe misunderstood, or like there are some countries that have gone to like a income-based fine system. So like if you are poorer, you pay a smaller fine because you have less money. Mm-hmm. And it still hurts the same amount because relatively speaking, you have less money. So, $25 fine versus like $100 fine for a rich person, like it hurts the same amount because of how much you make. So anyway, yeah, fines and fees are just bad. I mean, like, and they're so bad in Oklahoma to the point where like we should just get rid of them. Mm-hmm. Because there are some studies that show that like, and research that I've been a part of where it's like 99% of people aren't paying certain types of fines. So it's like once basically everybody is not paying that fine, it's probably not worth doing. Just being honest.
Right. And it's like one of these points is that people, and obviously like you don't imbibe in marijuana or you don't speed because you're like desperate, but it's like criminal behavior comes out of desperate situations to make ends meet. Like the reason that people break into stores is because they have no other way of like accommodating for their like needs. Like there's a direct link to need-based income and like criminal activity. So it's like if you find someone this massive amount in conjunction to their daily income, it's like that's going to encourage them to like do more crimes. Like that's like it's a direct link.
Well, and then especially too if you're, I hate to even call it criminality, but it's like, your whatever this world perceives as criminality is related to addiction or mental health or some sort of treatable underlying condition. Maybe we should focus on that instead of the punishment.